Evelyn, a loving grandmother who had always been the rock of her family, suddenly found herself in a frightening situation when she kept mysteriously falling out of her wheelchair. Her son, Terrence, was beside himself with worry, unable to figure out why these accidents kept happening. But when he installed hidden cameras to get to the bottom of things, what he discovered would leave him heartbroken and change their family forever. How did this strong, beloved grandmother become the victim of such a heartbreaking situation? And what shocking truth did Terrence uncover that would change the way he saw his mother's pain? Stay tuned to find out. But before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if Evelyn and Terrence's emotional journey speaks to you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The golden rays of the late afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the living room of the Johnson family home. In her wheelchair, positioned near the window, sat Mrs. Evelyn Johnson, her weathered hands resting gently on the armrests. At 78 years old, her once tall frame had become slightly hunched, but her eyes still sparkled with the wisdom of decades lived. "Grandma, look what I made for you," exclaimed 8-year-old Zoe, bounding into the room with a colorful drawing clutched in her small hands. Mrs. Evelyn's face lit up as she turned to her granddaughter. "Oh, sweetheart, let me see that masterpiece of yours," she said, her voice warm and inviting. As Zoe approached, Mrs. Evelyn leaned forward in her wheelchair, eager to examine the artwork. Suddenly, without warning, the wheelchair tipped forward. Mrs. Evelyn let out a startled gasp as she tumbled to the floor, her frail body hitting the hardwood with a dull thud. "Grandma!" Zoe cried out, her eyes wide with fear. Terrence, Mrs. Evelyn's son, rushed into the room, alerted by the commotion. "Mama!" he exclaimed, hurrying to her side. "Are you okay? What happened?" Mrs. Evelyn winced as Terrence gently helped her back into the wheelchair. "Oh, it's nothing, baby. Just these old bones of mine not cooperating," she said, trying to brush off the incident with a weak smile. Terrence frowned, unconvinced. This wasn't the first time his mother had fallen from her wheelchair, and a nagging worry gnawed at him. "Mama, we need to be more careful. Maybe we should adjust your wheelchair or get you some extra support." "Nonsense," Mrs. Evelyn replied, patting his hand reassuringly. "I'm fine, just a little clumsy these days. Now, Zoe, honey, let me see that beautiful drawing of yours." As Zoe hesitantly approached again, this time more cautiously, Terrence couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He watched as his mother admired the drawing, her smile genuine but tinged with something he couldn't quite place. Was it sadness? Frustration? He couldn't be sure. Later that evening, as Terrence helped his wife Latoya clean up after dinner, he voiced his concerns. "I'm worried about Mama," he said, his brow furrowed as he dried a plate. "That's the third time she's fallen this week." Latoya nodded, her own face etched with concern. "I know, babe. It's scary. Do you think we should take her to see Dr. Thompson again? Maybe there's something we're missing." Terrence sighed, setting down the dish towel. "Maybe, but every time we bring it up, she insists she's fine. You know how stubborn she can be. Just like someone else I know," Latoya said with a small smile, nudging her husband playfully. Terrence couldn't help but chuckle. Yeah, I wonder where I got it from." His smile faded as he glanced towards the living room, where he could hear his mother's soft laughter as she watched TV with the kids. "I just can't shake this feeling that there's more to these falls than she's letting on." As the days passed, the incidents continued. Each time Mrs. Evelyn fell, the family's concern grew. Terrence found himself constantly on edge, ears straining for any sound that might indicate his mother was in trouble. One afternoon, as Mrs. Evelyn napped in her room, Terrence sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. Latoya joined him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Talk to me, babe," she said softly. "What's going through that head of yours?" Terrence looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of worry and determination. I think I need to do something more. We can't just keep waiting for the next fall to happen." Latoya nodded encouragingly. "What are you thinking?" Terrence hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I'm thinking of installing some hidden cameras, just to keep an eye on her when we're not in the room." Latoya's eyebrows shot up. "Hidden cameras? Are you sure that's a good idea? Your mama values her privacy." If she found out. I know, Terrence said, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. But what choice do we have? We need to figure out what's causing these falls before she seriously hurts herself. After a long discussion, weighing the pros and cons, LaToya reluctantly agreed. The next day, while Mrs. Evelyn was out for her weekly hair appointment with LaToya, Terrence carefully installed small, discreet cameras in the living room and Mrs. Evelyn's bedroom. As he worked, a wave of guilt washed over him. He felt like he was betraying his mother's trust, invading her privacy. But the image of her frail body, sprawled on the floor, potentially seriously injured, steeled his resolve. This was for her own good, he told himself. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Mrs. Evelyn seemed in good spirits. She regaled them with stories from her youth, her eyes twinkling as she described the mischief she and her siblings would get into. You know, she said, pausing to take a sip of water, sometimes I feel like I'm right back there in those carefree days. Your grandfather? Oh, how he could make me laugh. A shadow passed over her face for a moment, so brief that Terrence almost missed it. But then her smile returned, and she continued her story. As Terrence helped his mother into bed that night, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt about the hidden camera now watching over her. "Good night, Mama," he said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "I love you." Mrs. Evelyn reached up to pat his cheek affectionately. "I love you too, baby. You're such a good son, taking care of your old mama like this." Terrence swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "You're not old, Mama, and I'll always take care of you. That's a promise." As he turned off the light and closed the door, Terrence lingered for a moment, listening. He could have sworn he heard a soft sigh, but then all was quiet. The next few days passed without incident, but Terrence remained vigilant. He found himself constantly checking the camera feeds on his phone, looking for any sign of trouble. But each time, he saw only his mother going about her daily routine, reading her Bible, watching her favorite game shows, chatting with the grandkids. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow on the Johnson family as they gathered for breakfast. Terrence sat at the head of the table, his eyes heavy from another night of restless sleep. Across from him, Mrs. Evelyn slowly stirred her oatmeal, her gaze distant. "Mama, how are you feeling this morning?" Terrence asked, trying to keep his voice light despite the worry gnawing at him. Mrs. Evelyn looked up, a small smile touching her lips. "Oh, I'm just fine, baby. Don't you worry about me." LaToya exchanged a glance with her husband, concern etched on her face. It had been 3 days since they'd installed the hidden cameras, and yet another fall had occurred just yesterday afternoon. As if reading their thoughts, Mrs. Evelyn's smile faltered. "I'm sorry about that tumble yesterday. I just can't seem to remember what happened. One minute I was sitting there, and the next." She trailed off, shaking her head. Terrence leaned forward, his breakfast forgotten. "Mama, it's okay. We just want to make sure you're safe. Do you think maybe we should talk to Dr. Thompson again? Maybe get some more tests done?" Mrs. Evelyn's eyes flashed with a hint of defiance. "Now, Terrence, I've told you before, I'm not going to spend my days being poked and prodded by doctors. It's just these old bones of mine, that's all." LaToya stepped in, her voice gentle. "We know, Mom. We just want to help. Maybe we could look into getting some extra help around the house. Someone to be with you when we're not here." "Absolutely not," Mrs. Evelyn said firmly. "I'm not having some stranger in my house, watching my every move. I'm not helpless, you know." Terrence sighed, running a hand over his face. "We know you're not helpless, Mama. We just want to understand what's causing these falls." The conversation was interrupted by the kids rushing in, backpacks in hand, ready for school. As the family bustled about, getting ready for the day, Terrence couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. Later that evening, after putting the kids to bed, Terrence sat in his home office, his eyes glued to the computer screen. He had been reviewing the footage from the hidden cameras for hours, searching for any clue that might explain his mother's falls. LaToya entered the room, carrying 2 mugs of steaming tea. She set one down beside her husband and perched on the edge of the desk. "Any luck?" she asked softly. Terrence shook his head, frustration evident in his voice. "Nothing. I've watched these videos 100 times, and I can't see anything that would explain why she's falling. It's like one second she's fine, and the next." He trailed off, Rewinding the footage once again. On the screen, Mrs. Evelyn sat peacefully in her wheelchair, reading a book. Suddenly, without any apparent reason, she tipped forward, falling out of the chair. "There!" Terrence exclaimed, pausing the video. "Do you see that? She doesn't even try to catch herself. It's like she just lets herself fall." Latoya leaned in, her brow furrowed. "That's strange. You'd think she'd at least put her hands out to break the fall." Terrence nodded, his mind racing. "And look at this one from yesterday." He pulled up another video, showing a similar scene. It's the exact same thing. No struggle, no attempt to stop herself. She just falls. Could it be some kind of seizure? Latoya suggested. Something that's happening so fast we can't see it? Terrence shook his head. "I don't think so. Dr. Thompson didn't find any signs of neurological issues in her last checkup. And Mama says she doesn't remember feeling dizzy or losing consciousness." They sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on them. Finally, Latoya spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Terrence, do you think, could this be deliberate?" Terrence's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "What? No, that's impossible. Why would Mama hurt herself on purpose?" Latoya shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "I don't know. It's just the way she falls. It's so controlled, almost like she's—" "Don't say it." Terrence cut her off, his voice sharp. "Mama would never do something like that. Never." Latoya reached out, placing a comforting hand on her husband's arm. "I'm sorry, baby. I didn't mean to upset you. I'm just trying to make sense of all this, same as you." Terrence softened, covering her hand with his own. "I know I'm sorry too. It's just, I feel so helpless. I can't protect her if I don't know what I'm protecting her from." As they sat there, the soft glow of the computer screen illuminating their worried faces, neither of them noticed the shadow that passed by the partially open door. In the hallway, Mrs. Evelyn sat in her wheelchair silently, her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a sob. She had come to ask for a glass of water, but now she retreated to her room, her heart heavy with a secret she couldn't bring herself to share. The next morning, Terrence woke early, determined to find some answers. He made his way to the kitchen, surprised to find his mother already there, sipping a cup of tea. "Mama, what are you doing up so early?" he asked, concern coloring his voice. Mrs. Evelyn looked up, a wan smile on her face. "Oh, you know me, baby. I've always been an early riser. Thought I'd enjoy the quiet before everyone else wakes up." Terrence nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He sat down across from his mother, studying her face. She looked tired, he noticed, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. "Mama," he began carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Mrs. Evelyn set down her cup, her eyes wary. "What is it, Terrence?" Terrence took a deep breath. "These falls you've been having, is there something you're not telling us? Something that might explain why they keep happening?" For a moment, something flickered in Mrs. Evelyn's eyes. Fear? Guilt? But it was gone so quickly, Terrence wasn't sure he'd seen it at all. "Terrence, baby, I've told you everything I know," she said, her voice steady. "I wish I could explain it, but I just can't remember what happens. One minute I'm fine, and the next." She shrugged helplessly. Terrence nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. He had hoped that maybe, in this quiet moment, his mother might open up to him. But it seemed the mystery would remain unsolved, at least for now. As the days passed, the tension in the Johnson household continued to grow. Terrence found himself constantly on edge, jumping at every sound, terrified that it might be the thud of his mother falling again. Latoya tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for the kids, but even they could sense that something was wrong. One afternoon, as Terrence was reviewing yet another day's worth of footage, he noticed something odd. In each of the videos leading up to a fall, his mother seemed to be talking to herself. He leaned in closer, straining to hear what she was saying, but the audio wasn't clear enough. Frustrated, he called Latoya into the room. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the screen. "Do you see how her lips are moving just before she falls? It's like she's talking to someone, but there's no one there." Latoya frowned, studying the footage. "You're right. I wonder what she's saying." Terrence shook his head. "I can't make it out, but it happens every time, right before she falls." It can't be a coincidence. They looked at each other, the same thought crossing their minds. Could this be a sign of dementia? Was Mrs. Evelyn experiencing hallucinations? "We need to talk to Dr. Thompson," LaToya said firmly. "This isn't normal, Terrence. Whatever's going on, your mama needs help." Terrence nodded, feeling a mix of relief and dread. On one hand, they might finally get some answers. On the other, he was terrified of what those answers might be. That evening, as the family sat down to dinner, Terrence cleared his throat. "Mama," he began, trying to keep his voice steady, "LaToya and I have been talking, and we think it might be a good idea to schedule another appointment with Dr. Thompson." Mrs. Evelyn looked up from her plate, her fork pausing midway to her mouth. "Oh, and why is that?" Terrence exchanged a glance with LaToya before continuing. "We're just concerned about these falls, Mama. We want to make sure there isn't something we're missing." For a moment, Mrs. Evelyn said nothing. Then, to everyone's surprise, she let out a small chuckle. "You two worry too much. I'm fine, really. Just a little clumsy in my old age, that's all." "But Mama," Terrence pressed, "these falls aren't normal. And we've noticed, well, sometimes it seems like you're talking to yourself just before it happens." The smile froze on Mrs. Evelyn's face. For a split second, Terrence saw something in her eyes, a flicker of panic, quickly replaced by a carefully neutral expression. "I don't know what you're talking about, Terrence," she said, her voice unnaturally calm. "I certainly don't talk to myself. Maybe your eyes are playing tricks on you." LaToya stepped in, her voice gentle. "Mom, we're not trying to upset you. We just want to make sure you're okay. If there's something going on, something you're not telling us, we want to help." Mrs. Evelyn set down her fork, her appetite apparently gone. "I appreciate your concern, both of you. But I'm telling you, there's nothing wrong with me that a little rest won't cure. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I'll turn in early tonight." Before anyone could protest, she wheeled herself away from the table and towards her room. Terrence and LaToya watched her go, their hearts heavy with worry and frustration. Later that night, as Terrence lay awake in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. He replayed the conversation at dinner in his mind, trying to make sense of his mother's reaction. Suddenly, he sat bolt upright, startling LaToya awake. "The cameras," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to check the cameras right now." Confused and groggy, LaToya followed her husband to the home office. Terrence quickly pulled up the live feed from his mother's room, his heart racing. On the screen, they saw Mrs. Evelyn sitting up in bed, her wheelchair pushed to the side. Her lips were moving, and this time, thanks to the camera's proximity, they could clearly hear what she was saying. "I'm trying, my love," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm trying to join you, but they won't let me go." Terrence and LaToya looked at each other, shock and horror dawning on their faces as the terrible truth began to sink in. The mystery of Mrs. Evelyn's falls was finally unraveling, but the reality was far more heartbreaking than they could have ever imagined. Terrence's heart raced as he frantically searched through more footage. He wasn't able to make out her words earlier, but now he had an idea what she must be saying. To his horror, he found the same pattern repeated in every fall. Each time, his mother would whisper similar phrases. "I'm coming, darling. Just wait for me. We'll be together again, I promise. I can't bear this loneliness anymore. I'm on my way." The truth hit Terrence like a physical blow. These falls weren't accidents. They weren't caused by frailty or clumsiness. His mother was deliberately trying to hurt herself. They sat in stunned silence for a moment, the gravity of the situation settling over them like a heavy blanket. Finally, LaToya spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" Terrence ran a hand over his face, his mind racing. I don't know, but we can't ignore this. We have to confront her, get her help." LaToya nodded, squeezing her husband's shoulder. "First thing in the morning," she agreed. "We'll talk to her together." As they made their way back to bed, neither of them could shake the image of Mrs. Evelyn, alone in her room, whispering to a husband who was no longer there. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The next morning, Terrence woke early, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he had to do. He found LaToya in the kitchen, already brewing a pot of coffee. They exchanged a look of silent understanding. "Is Mama up yet?" Terrence asked, his voice low. Latoya shook her head. I haven't heard her moving around. Do you want me to check on her? Terrence nodded, grateful for his wife's support. As Latoya disappeared down the hallway, he poured himself a cup of coffee, trying to steady his nerves. How do you confront your mother about something like this? A few minutes later, Latoya returned with Mrs. Evelyn. The elderly woman looked tired, dark circles under her eyes betraying a restless night. Good morning, Mama, Terrence said, forcing a smile. How did you sleep? Mrs. Evelyn waved a dismissive hand. Oh, you know how it is at my age. Sleep comes and goes. But I'm just fine. Don't you worry. Terrence and Latoya exchanged a glance. It was now or never. Mama, Terrence began, his voice gentle but firm. We need to talk about something important. Can you join us in the living room? A flicker of uncertainty passed over Mrs. Evelyn's face, but she nodded. Of course, baby. What's this about? As they settled in the living room, Mrs. Evelyn in her wheelchair and Terrence and Latoya on the couch across from her, an uncomfortable silence fell over them. Terrence took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. Mama, he started, his voice cracking slightly. We know about the falls. We know they're not accidents. Mrs. Evelyn's face remained impassive, but her hands tightened on the armrests of her wheelchair. I don't know what you're talking about, Terrence. I told you I'm just a little clumsy these days. Terrence leaned forward, his eyes pleading. Mama, please. We saw the footage. We heard what you were saying before each fall. For a moment, Mrs. Evelyn said nothing. Then, almost imperceptibly, her shoulders sagged. You've been watching me? She asked, her voice small and defeated. We were worried about you, Latoya explained gently. We just wanted to understand what was causing the falls. We never expected. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Mrs. Evelyn looked away, her gaze fixed on a framed photo of her late husband on the mantel. Show me, she said quietly. Terrence hesitated, then nodded. He retrieved his laptop and pulled up one of the video clips. As they watched together, Mrs. Evelyn's whispered words filled the room. I'm coming, my love. We'll be together soon. When the clip ended, there was a heavy silence. Then, to Terrence and Latoya's surprise, Mrs. Evelyn began to laugh. It was a hollow, mirthless sound that soon gave way to heart-wrenching sobs. Oh, look at me, she cried, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. What a foolish old woman I've become. Terrence moved to kneel beside his mother's wheelchair, taking her trembling hands in his. Mama, please. Talk to us. Help us understand. Mrs. Evelyn took a shaky breath, her eyes meeting her son's. I miss him, Terrence. I miss your father so much it physically hurts. Every day without him feels like an eternity. Terrence felt his own eyes filling with tears. I know, Mama. We all miss him. But this, what you're doing, it's not the answer. Mrs. Evelyn shook her head, a bitter smile on her lips. You don't understand, baby. You have your whole life ahead of you. Your beautiful wife, your children. But me? I'm just a burden now, a shell of who I used to be. That's not true, Latoya exclaimed, moving to join them. You're not a burden, Mom. You're the heart of this family. Am I? Mrs. Evelyn asked, her voice tinged with sadness. Look at me. I can't even take care of myself anymore. I'm trapped in this chair, dependent on all of you for everything. This isn't living, it's just existing. Terrence squeezed his mother's hands, his heart breaking for her pain. Mama, listen to me. You are not a burden. You are loved, deeply and completely. We need you here with us. Mrs. Evelyn's eyes filled with fresh tears. But I need him, Terrence. Your father was my whole world for over 50 years. How am I supposed to go on without him? By remembering that you're not alone, Latoya said softly. We're here for you, Mom. All of us. And we want to help you through this. For a long moment, Mrs. Evelyn said nothing. Then, slowly she nodded. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you all like this. I felt so lost. Terrence stood, pulling his mother into a gentle embrace. We're going to get through this together, Mama. I promise. But you have to promise me something too. Mrs. Evelyn looked up at her son, her eyes questioning. Promise me you'll stop trying to hurt yourself, Terrence said, his voice firm but loving. "Promise me you'll let us help you." Mrs. Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. "I promise," she said softly. "I'll try." As the family held each other close, tears flowing freely, a sense of both relief and trepidation filled the room. They had uncovered the painful truth, but the road ahead would not be easy. There were wounds to heal, trust to rebuild, and a grieving process that had been interrupted for far too long. Later that day, as Mrs. Evelyn rested in her room, Terrence and Latoya sat at the kitchen table, discussing their next steps. "We need to get her professional help," Latoya said, her voice firm. "A therapist who specializes in grief counseling for the elderly." Terrence nodded in agreement. "And we need to make some changes around here. We can't leave her alone so much. Maybe we could look into some part-time in-home care?" As they continued to plan, both felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. They had crossed a significant hurdle in getting Mrs. Evelyn to open up about her pain, but they knew the journey was far from over. In her room, Mrs. Evelyn sat in her wheelchair, gazing at the photo of her late husband on her nightstand. She reached out, gently tracing his smiling face with a trembling finger. "Oh, James," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry, my love. I wanted so badly to be with you again. But our boy needs me here a little longer. Can you wait for me, darling? Just a little while longer?" As she spoke, a warm breeze drifted through the open window, rustling the curtains. For a moment, Mrs. Evelyn could have sworn she felt a familiar, comforting presence in the room. A small smile touched her lips as she closed her eyes, allowing herself to remember the good times, the laughter, the love she had shared with her husband. For the first time in a long while, Mrs. Evelyn felt a glimmer of hope. The pain was still there, a constant ache in her heart, but it was tempered now by the knowledge that she wasn't alone. Her family loved her, needed her, and maybe, just maybe, that could be enough to keep her going. As the days passed, the Johnson household settled into a new rhythm. Terrence and Latoya worked tirelessly to ensure Mrs. Evelyn felt loved and included in every aspect of family life. They rearranged their schedules to spend more time with her, encouraging the children to do the same. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Latoya broached a subject they'd been discussing privately. "Mom," she said gently, "Terrence and I have been thinking. We believe it might be helpful for you to talk to someone professional about your feelings. A therapist who specializes in grief counseling for seniors." Mrs. Evelyn's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down slowly, her brow furrowing. "A therapist? I don't know, honey. At my age, talking to a stranger about my feelings seems, well, it seems a bit pointless." Terrence leaned forward, his voice earnest. "Mama, it's not pointless. Grief doesn't have an age limit. And sometimes, talking to someone outside the family can provide a different perspective, help us see things we might miss." Mrs. Evelyn looked uncertain, her eyes darting between her son and daughter-in-law. I don't know if I can do that. Open up to a stranger about James, about what I tried to do." Latoya reached out, covering Mrs. Evelyn's hand with her own. "Mom, the therapist isn't there to judge you. They're there to help you process your grief, to find healthy ways to cope with your pain." Terrence nodded in agreement. "We'll be with you every step of the way, Mama. If you want, one of us can go with you to the sessions, at least at first." Mrs. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. Finally, she took a deep breath and nodded. "All right, I'll try it. For you, for the family, I'll try." The relief on Terrence and Latoya's faces was palpable. Terrence squeezed his mother's shoulder gently. "Thank you, Mama. That's all we ask. Just try." The next week, Mrs. Evelyn had her first therapy session with Dr. Eleanor Wright, a kind-faced woman in her 60s who specialized in geriatric grief counseling. Terrence accompanied his mother, sitting in the waiting room during the session. When Mrs. Evelyn emerged an hour later, her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but there was a lightness to her that Terrence hadn't seen in months. On the drive home, she was quiet, lost in thought. "How did it go, Mama?" Terrence asked gently as they pulled into the driveway. Mrs. Evelyn turned to him, a small smile on her lips. It was good, baby. Hard but good. Dr. Wright, she understands. She's helping me see that my feelings are normal, that grieving is a process. Terrence felt a surge of hope. That's wonderful, Mama. I'm so proud of you for doing this. Mrs. Evelyn reached out, patting her son's hand. Thank you for pushing me to do it. I think this might really help. As the weeks passed, Mrs. Evelyn continued her therapy sessions. Slowly but surely, the family began to see changes. She started to open up more, sharing stories about James that made her smile instead of cry. She began to take an interest in her surroundings again, asking about the children's activities and Terrence's work. One Saturday morning, as Terrence was helping his mother into her wheelchair, she surprised him with a request. Baby, do you think we could go to the park today? I'd like to feed the ducks like James and I used to do. Terrence felt his heart swell with joy. Of course, Mama. That's a wonderful idea. We'll make a family day of it. The park outing was a resounding success. Mrs. Evelyn laughed as she watched her grandchildren chase the ducks, her eyes twinkling with a spark of life that had been missing for so long. As they sat by the pond, she regaled the family with stories of her and James's early dates in this very park. He proposed to me right over there, she said, pointing to an old oak tree. Got down on one knee and everything, right in front of everyone. I was so embarrassed, but oh, so happy. Terrence watched his mother as she spoke, marveling at the change in her. There was still sadness in her eyes, but it was tempered now by fond remembrance and love. That evening, as Terrence was tucking his mother into bed, she reached out and took his hand. Terrence, she said softly, I want you to know something. What is it, Mama? He asked, sitting on the edge of her bed. Mrs. Evelyn's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her smile was genuine. I'm glad I'm still here. I'm glad you didn't let me give up. I think James would be proud of us, don't you? Terrence felt his own eyes fill with tears. He leaned down, pulling his mother into a gentle embrace. You would, Mama? He'd be so proud of you. And so am I. As the months passed, the Johnson family settled into a new normal. Mrs. Evelyn continued her therapy sessions, gradually learning to navigate her grief in healthier ways. The family made a concerted effort to keep her involved in their daily lives, from helping with homework to planning family outings. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Mrs. Evelyn surprised everyone with an announcement. I've been thinking, she said, her voice steady and clear. I'd like to start a grief support group at the community center for other seniors who've lost their spouses. Dr. Wright thinks it's a good idea, and, well, I think I could help others who are going through what I did. The table fell silent for a moment, everyone processing this unexpected declaration. Then, Terrence broke into a wide smile. Mama, that's a wonderful idea. I think you'd be great at that. LaToya nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely, Mom. Your experience could really help others who are struggling. Mrs. Evelyn's eyes sparkled with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. You really think so? I'm not sure I'm qualified, but I know how much it would have helped me to talk to someone who understood in those early days. Terrence reached out, squeezing his mother's hand. You're more than qualified, Mama. Your strength, your journey, it's inspiring. And I know Dad would be so proud of you for wanting to help others. At the mention of James, Mrs. Evelyn's eyes misted over, but her smile remained. You're right, baby. James always did say I had a gift for comforting people. Maybe this is my way of honoring his memory. As the family discussed the logistics of starting the support group, Terrence couldn't help but marvel at the transformation in his mother. The woman who had once been so lost in her grief that she tried to harm herself was now looking to use her experience to help others. It was a testament to her strength, to the power of love and support, and to the human spirit's capacity for healing. Later that night, as Terrence lay in bed reflecting on the day's events, he felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. The journey had been difficult, filled with pain and heartache, but they had come through it together. His mother was finding purpose again, rediscovering joy in life. He thought back to those dark days when he had first discovered the truth behind her falls. The fear, the helplessness he had felt seemed like a distant memory now. They had faced the darkness together and emerged stronger for it. As he drifted off to sleep, Terrence sent a silent thank you to the universe. for the hidden cameras that had revealed the painful truth, for the strength his mother had found to keep fighting, for the love that had carried them through. They had weathered the storm, and though the seas might never be completely calm again, they had learned to navigate the waves together. In her room, Mrs. Evelyn lay awake, her thoughts drifting to James. She reached out, touching the empty space beside her where he used to sleep. "I'm doing it, my love," she whispered into the darkness. "I'm living, just like you would have wanted, and I'm going to help others do the same. Watch over me, darling. I'll see you again someday, but not yet. Not yet." With a peaceful smile on her face, Mrs. Evelyn closed her eyes, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. She was no longer just existing, she was living, and that, she knew, was the greatest tribute she could pay to the love she and James had shared. The warm glow of the afternoon sun filtered through the windows of the community center, casting long shadows across the circle of chairs arranged in the middle of the room. Mrs. Evelyn Johnson sat in her wheelchair at the head of the circle, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she watched the small group of elderly men and women file in, their faces a mixture of apprehension and hope. It had been 6 months since Mrs. Evelyn had first proposed the idea of starting a grief support group for seniors who had lost their spouses. With the help of her family and Dr. Wright, she had worked tirelessly to make it a reality. Now, as she looked around at the faces of those who had come seeking solace and understanding, she felt a flutter of nervous excitement in her chest. "Welcome, everyone," Mrs. Evelyn said, her voice warm and inviting. "Thank you for joining us today. I know how difficult it can be to take that first step, to reach out when you're hurting, but I want you all to know that you're not alone in this journey." As the meeting progressed, Mrs. Evelyn shared her own story. The crushing weight of grief that had driven her to despair, the love of her family that had pulled her back from the brink, and the ongoing process of healing and rediscovery. She watched as the tension in the room slowly eased, saw heads nodding in understanding and eyes glistening with unshed tears. One by one, the other members of the group began to open up, sharing their own stories of loss and loneliness. Mrs. Evelyn listened intently, offering words of comfort and encouragement when needed, guiding the conversation with a gentle hand. As the meeting drew to a close, a frail-looking woman named Margaret approached Mrs. Evelyn, her eyes red-rimmed but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, clasping Mrs. Evelyn's hand. "I've felt so alone these past months. I didn't think anyone could understand. But being here today, listening to you and the others, it helps." Mrs. Evelyn squeezed Margaret's hand, her heart swelling with empathy. "You're not alone, dear. We're all in this together. And it does get easier, I promise. Not quickly, and not without pain, but it does get easier." As the last of the attendees filed out, Terrence appeared in the doorway, a proud smile on his face. "How did it go, Mama?" he asked, wheeling her towards the exit. Mrs. Evelyn's eyes sparkled with a mixture of exhaustion and fulfillment. "Oh, baby, it was something special. I think we really helped some people today. And you know what? I think they helped me too." Terrence leaned down, planting a kiss on his mother's cheek. "I'm so proud of you, Mama. Dad would be too, you know." Mrs. Evelyn nodded, a bittersweet smile touching her lips. "I know, baby. I felt him with me today, cheering me on." As they made their way home, Mrs. Evelyn found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. The dark days when she had tried to join James in death seemed like a distant nightmare now. She still missed him terribly, of course. There wasn't a day that went by when she didn't think of him, didn't yearn for his touch or his laugh. But the crushing weight of grief had lightened, allowing room for other emotions. Gratitude for the life they had shared, love for her family, and a renewed sense of purpose. The weeks flew by, and Mrs. Evelyn threw herself into her new role with gusto. The grief support group grew, attracting more members as word spread. Mrs. Evelyn worked closely with Dr. Wright to develop strategies for helping the group members cope with their loss and find new meaning in life. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Zoe, now 9 years old, turned to her grandmother with curious eyes. "Grandma," she asked, her voice hesitant, "do you still miss Grandpa?" The table fell silent, all eyes turning to Mrs. Evelyn. She set down her fork, considering her answer carefully. Yes, sweetheart, I do, she said finally, her voice soft but steady. I'll always miss your grandpa. But you know what? Missing him doesn't hurt quite as much as it used to. Zoe nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. Is that because of your special group? The one where you help other grandmas and grandpas? Mrs. Evelyn smiled, reaching out to pat Zoe's hand. That's part of it, honey. Helping others who are going through the same thing. It reminds me that I'm not alone. And it makes me feel like I'm honoring your grandpa's memory by spreading the love he gave me. Terrence watched this exchange with a lump in his throat. The transformation in his mother never ceased to amaze him. Gone was the fragile, despairing woman who had tried to harm herself. In her place was this strong, compassionate matriarch who was not only facing her own grief, but helping others navigate theirs as well. Later that night, as Terrence was helping his mother prepare for bed, she surprised him with a request. Terrence, baby, she said, her voice hesitant, I've been thinking I'd like to visit your father's grave. Terrence paused in the act of turning down the bed covers, his heart skipping a beat. Mrs. Evelyn hadn't visited James's grave since the funeral, always finding excuses to avoid it. Are you sure, Mama? He asked gently. There's no rush if you're not ready. Mrs. Evelyn nodded, her eyes clear and determined. I'm sure. I think it's time. Will you come with me? Terrence pulled his mother into a gentle embrace. Of course, Mama. Whenever you're ready. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a crisp autumn breeze rustling the leaves of the old oak trees that lined the cemetery path. Terrence pushed his mother's wheelchair slowly, allowing her time to gather her thoughts as they approached James's final resting place. As they reached the simple headstone bearing James's name, Mrs. Evelyn reached out, her fingers tracing the engraved letters. Hello, my love, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry it's taken me so long to visit. I wasn't ready before. Terrence stood back, giving his mother space as she spoke to her late husband. He watched as she poured out her heart, telling James about her journey through grief, about the support group, about the grandchildren's latest achievements. There were tears, yes, but there was laughter too, as Mrs. Evelyn recounted funny anecdotes and cherished memories. Finally, Mrs. Evelyn turned to her son, her eyes shimmering but her smile peaceful. Thank you for bringing me here, baby. I needed this closure, I suppose. A chance to say goodbye properly. As they made their way back to the car, Mrs. Evelyn's wheelchair hit a rough patch of ground, jolting her slightly. For a moment, Terrence felt a flash of the old panic, remembering the falls that had once plagued his mother. But Mrs. Evelyn merely laughed, adjusting herself in the chair. Goodness, she chuckled. Your father always did say I needed a smoother ride. Terrence couldn't help but join in her laughter, marveling at how far they had come. The woman who had once seen her wheelchair as a prison now faced its inconveniences with humor and grace. As the weeks passed, Mrs. Evelyn continued to flourish in her role as leader of the grief support group. She worked tirelessly, organizing outings for the group members, arranging for guest speakers, and always lending a compassionate ear to those who needed it. One day, as Mrs. Evelyn was preparing for a group meeting, she received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Wright knocked on the door of the community center, a warm smile on her face. Mrs. Johnson, she said, I hope you don't mind me dropping by. I wanted to see how things were going with the group. Mrs. Evelyn welcomed her in, her face lighting up. Oh, Dr. Wright, I'm so glad you're here. Things are going wonderfully. In fact, I was hoping to talk to you about an idea I've had. As they settled in, Mrs. Evelyn shared her vision. She wanted to expand the support group to create a network of similar groups across the city. There are so many seniors out there who are struggling with grief, she explained, her eyes shining with passion. I want to reach as many of them as we can. Dr. Wright listened intently, her expression thoughtful. That's a wonderful idea, Mrs. Johnson, but it's also a big undertaking. Are you sure you're up for it? Mrs. Evelyn nodded firmly. I am. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I have a real purpose. James always said I had a gift for helping people. I think this is what I'm meant to do with the time I have left. Dr. Wright reached out, squeezing Mrs. Evelyn's hand. Well then, she said with a smile. "Let's make it happen. I have some contacts at other community centers who might be interested in starting their own groups, and I'd be happy to help train new group leaders." As they began to plan, Mrs. Evelyn felt a surge of excitement. She thought back to those dark days when she had tried to end her life and marveled at how far she had come. The pain of losing James would always be with her, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it had become the catalyst for a new chapter in her life, one filled with purpose and the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of others. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Mrs. Evelyn shared her plans for expanding the support group network. Terrence and LaToya listened with growing amazement as she outlined her vision, her eyes alight with enthusiasm. "Mama," Terrence said when she had finished, "this is incredible. But are you sure it's not too much? We don't want you overexerting yourself." Mrs. Evelyn fixed her son with a determined look. "Terrence, baby, I may be old and I may be in this wheelchair, but I am far from finished. This work, it gives me strength. It makes me feel alive in a way I haven't felt since your father passed." LaToya reached out, squeezing her mother-in-law's hand. "We're so proud of you, Mom. If this is what you want to do, we're behind you 100%. As the weeks turned into months, Mrs. Evelyn's vision began to take shape. With the help of Dr. Wright and a team of volunteers, new grief support groups were established in community centers across the city. Mrs. Evelyn took on the role of mentor, training new group leaders and sharing her experiences. The work was challenging, often emotionally draining, but Mrs. Evelyn thrived on it. She found herself looking forward to each day, eager to make a difference in the lives of others who were struggling with loss. One afternoon, as Mrs. Evelyn was preparing to leave for a training session at a new support group location, she caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. She paused, studying her reflection. The face that looked back at her was lined with age, yes, but it was also alive with purpose. Her eyes, once dulled by grief, now sparkled with determination and compassion. "Well, James," she murmured to herself, a small smile playing on her lips, "what do you think of your old girl now? I'm not ready to join you just yet, my love. I've still got work to do down here." As if in response, a warm breeze drifted through the open window, carrying with it the scent of blooming roses, James's favorite flower. Mrs. Evelyn closed her eyes, basking in the moment. She could almost feel his presence, his pride and love washing over her. The sound of a car horn outside broke the spell. Mrs. Evelyn opened her eyes, her smile widening. Terrence was waiting to drive her to the community center. With a final glance at her reflection, she wheeled herself towards the door, ready to face another day of challenges and opportunities. As they drove, Terrence couldn't help but marvel at the change in his mother. Gone was the defeated woman who had once seen her wheelchair as a prison. In her place was this vibrant, purposeful person who viewed her mobility aid as simply another tool to help her achieve her goals. "You know, Mama," Terrence said as they neared the community center, "I was thinking about those hidden cameras we installed all those months ago." Mrs. Evelyn turned to him, her eyebrow raised. "Oh, what about them, baby?" Terrence shook his head, a rueful smile on his face. "I was so scared back then, so desperate to figure out what was causing your falls. I never imagined that those cameras would lead us here, to all of this." Mrs. Evelyn reached out, patting her son's hand. "Life has a funny way of working out, doesn't it? Those cameras, they saved my life in more ways than one. They didn't just stop me from hurting myself. They opened the door to this new chapter of my life." As they pulled up to the community center, they saw a small crowd gathered outside. To Mrs. Evelyn's surprise, she recognized many of the faces. Members of her original support group, volunteers from other centers, even Dr. Wright. LaToya stepped forward as Terrence helped Mrs. Evelyn out of the car. "Surprise," she said, her face beaming. "We couldn't let this day pass without a little celebration." Mrs. Evelyn looked around in confusion. "Celebration? What for?" Dr. Wright stepped forward, a wrapped package in her hands. "Mrs. Johnson, it's been exactly 1 year since you started the first grief support group. In that time, you've touched countless lives, brought hope to those who thought they had none left. We wanted to honor that." As Dr. Wright handed her the package, Mrs. Evelyn felt tears welling up in her eyes. With trembling hands, She unwrapped it to reveal a beautiful plaque. Engraved on it were the words, "In recognition of Mrs. Evelyn Johnson, whose courage in the face of grief has become a beacon of hope for others. Your strength inspires us all." Mrs. Evelyn looked up at the smiling faces surrounding her, her heart overflowing with emotion. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "This work, helping others, it's been my lifeline. You've all given me so much more than I could ever give you." Margaret, the woman from the first support group meeting, stepped forward. "That's not true, Evelyn," she said softly. "You showed us that there's life after loss. You gave us hope when we thought all was lost. We can never thank you enough for that." As the group moved inside for a small reception, Mrs. Evelyn found herself surrounded by well-wishers, each with a story to share about how the support group had helped them. She listened with a full heart, marveling at the ripple effect of healing that had spread from her own journey through grief. Later that evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, the mood was celebratory. Zoe had made a special card for her grandmother, decorated with glitter and hand-drawn flowers. "You're my hero, Grandma," she said shyly as she presented it. Mrs. Evelyn pulled her granddaughter into a tight hug. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "You and your brother, your parents, you're all my heroes. I wouldn't be here without you." As the night wore on and the younger children were put to bed, Mrs. Evelyn found herself sitting on the back porch with Terrence and Latoya. The night was clear, a blanket of stars twinkling overhead. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Evelyn said after a comfortable silence, "about those dark days when I was trying to join your father." Terrence tensed slightly, but Mrs. Evelyn reached out, patting his hand reassuringly. No, don't worry, baby. I'm not going back there. I want you both to know how grateful I am for not giving up on me, for pushing me to get help, for supporting me through all of this." Latoya leaned in, wrapping an arm around her mother-in-law's shoulders. "We'll always be here for you, Mom, through the good times and the bad." Terrence nodded in agreement. "We're just thankful you're still here with us, Mama. You've shown us all what real strength looks like." Mrs. Evelyn smiled, her eyes misting over as she gazed up at the stars. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think that loving someone meant you couldn't go on without them. But I've learned that real love, it gives you the strength to keep living, to honor their memory by making the most of the life you have left." As they sat there, enjoying the peaceful night and each other's company, Mrs. Evelyn felt a sense of contentment wash over her. The journey had been long and difficult, but she had emerged stronger, more resilient, and with a renewed sense of purpose. The next morning, Mrs. Evelyn woke early, her mind already buzzing with ideas for the support group network. As she wheeled herself to the kitchen, she was surprised to find Terrence already there, nursing a cup of coffee. "Good morning, Mama," he said, smiling warmly. "You're up early." Mrs. Evelyn chuckled, accepting the cup of tea Terrence offered her. "Oh, you know me, baby. Can't stay in bed when there's work to be done." Terrence's smile faltered slightly. "About that, Mama, I've been thinking, maybe it's time we hired some help. Someone to assist you with the day-to-day running of the support groups. You're doing so much, and I worry about you overdoing it." For a moment, Mrs. Evelyn felt a flash of indignation. Didn't her son understand how important this work was to her? But as she looked at Terrence's concerned face, she realized he was coming from a place of love. "You might be right, baby," she conceded after a moment. "This old body isn't as spry as it used to be. Maybe having some help wouldn't be such a bad idea." Terrence's relief was palpable. "I'm glad you see it that way, Mama. I've actually been doing some research. There's a program at the local college for students studying gerontology and social work. They offer internships for students to work with community organizations. I thought maybe we could look into that." Mrs. Evelyn's eyes lit up at the idea. "Oh, Terrence, that's perfect. Not only will we get some help, but we'd be giving these young people valuable experience. And who knows? Maybe we could inspire some of them to continue working with seniors after they graduate." Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Evelyn worked with Terrence and Dr. Wright to set up a partnership with the local college. They interviewed several promising students before selecting 2 interns: Sarah, a bright-eyed young woman with a passion for geriatric care, and Michael, a soft-spoken young man who had lost his own grandmother to Alzheimer's and wanted to make a difference in the lives of seniors. As the interns settled into their roles, Mrs. Evelyn found herself energized by their enthusiasm and fresh perspectives. She took on the role of mentor, sharing her experiences and guiding them as they learned to navigate the complex emotions involved in grief counseling. One afternoon, as Mrs. Evelyn was wrapping up a training session with Sarah and Michael, she noticed Sarah seemed distracted. "Is everything all right, dear?" she asked gently. Sarah hesitated before responding. "Mrs. Johnson, I hope you don't mind me asking, but how do you do it? How do you listen to all these stories of loss and grief day after day without letting it overwhelm you?" Mrs. Evelyn wheeled herself closer to the young woman, reaching out to pat her hand. "Oh, my dear, that's a very good question. And the truth is, some days it does overwhelm me. There are times when I go home and cry for all the pain I've heard. But you know what keeps me going?" Sarah and Michael leaned in, eager to hear her answer. "Hope," Mrs. Evelyn said simply. "Every person who comes to our groups, every story of loss we hear, it's an opportunity to plant a seed of hope. We can't take away their pain, but we can show them that they're not alone, that there is a path forward. And when I see that spark of hope in someone's eyes, when I see them take that first step towards healing, well, that makes it all worthwhile." As the months passed, the support group network continued to grow. Mrs. Evelyn, with the help of her interns and a growing team of volunteers, expanded their reach to neighboring cities. She was invited to speak at conferences, sharing her experiences and inspiring others to start similar programs in their own communities. But as rewarding as the work was, it was also exhausting. Mrs. Evelyn found herself tiring more easily, needing more rest between activities. Terrence and LaToya watched with growing concern, torn between pride in her accomplishments and worry for her health. One evening, as Mrs. Evelyn was preparing for bed, she felt a sharp pain in her chest. She tried to brush it off, but when the pain persisted and she found herself short of breath, she knew she couldn't ignore it. "Terrence," she called out, her voice weak and shaky. "Terrence, baby, I need help." The next few hours passed in a blur of ambulance sirens, emergency room lights, and worried faces. When Mrs. Evelyn finally regained full consciousness, she found herself in a hospital bed, Terrence dozing in a chair beside her. "Terrence," she croaked, her throat dry. Terrence jerked awake, relief flooding his face as he saw his mother's eyes open. "Mama, thank God. How are you feeling?" Mrs. Evelyn tried to sit up, but found herself too weak. "What happened, baby?" Terrence gently explained that she had suffered a mild heart attack. The doctors said she would recover, but she needed to take things easier from now on. As the reality of her situation sank in, Mrs. Evelyn felt a wave of frustration wash over her. How could she take things easier when there was still so much work to be done? So many people who needed help? Over the next few days, as she recovered in the hospital, Mrs. Evelyn had many visitors. LaToya and the children came every day, bringing drawings and get-well cards. Dr. Wright stopped by, as did many members of the support groups. Sarah and Michael visited too, assuring her that they were keeping things running smoothly in her absence. On the day before she was due to be discharged, Mrs. Evelyn had an unexpected visitor. Margaret, the woman from her very first support group meeting, knocked gently on the door. "Margaret!" Mrs. Evelyn exclaimed, genuinely pleased to see her friend. "What a lovely surprise." Margaret sat down beside the bed, taking Mrs. Evelyn's hand in hers. "Evelyn, my dear, we've all been so worried about you. How are you feeling?" Mrs. Evelyn sighed. "Oh, I'm on the mend, but I'm frustrated, Margaret. There's so much more I want to do, so many people who need help. And now the doctors are telling me I need to slow down." Margaret listened patiently, a knowing look in her eyes. When Mrs. Evelyn finished, she squeezed her hand gently. "Evelyn, do you remember what you told me at that first meeting? When I was drowning in grief and couldn't see a way forward?" Mrs. Evelyn shook her head, unable to recall the specific conversation. "You told me that healing isn't a race, it's a journey," Margaret continued. "You said that it's okay to take breaks, to rest when we need to. That self-care isn't selfish, it's necessary." She paused, her eyes twinkling. I think it's time you took your own advice, my friend." As Margaret's words sank in, Mrs. Evelyn felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had been so focused on helping others that she had neglected her own well-being. And in doing so, she had nearly robbed her family, and all the people who depended on her, of her presence in their lives. "Oh, Margaret," she said softly, "when did you get so wise?" Margaret chuckled. "I learned from the best, didn't I?" That conversation marked a turning point for Mrs. Evelyn. When she returned home from the hospital, she sat down with Terrence, Latoya, and Dr. Wright to discuss the future of the support group network. "I've realized something," she told them. "This work, helping others through their grief, it's bigger than just me now. It needs to be able to continue even when I can't be there every day." Together, they devised a plan to restructure the organization. They would train more group leaders, delegate more responsibilities to the interns and volunteers, and set up a board of directors to oversee the network's operations. Mrs. Evelyn would take on more of an advisory role, still involved, but not carrying the day-to-day burden. As they implemented these changes over the next few months, Mrs. Evelyn found herself with more free time than she'd had in years. At first, she felt restless, unsure of how to fill her days. But gradually, she rediscovered old hobbies and found new ones. She started a small garden in the backyard, joined a book club at the local library, and spent more time with her grandchildren. One sunny afternoon, as Mrs. Evelyn sat in her garden, enjoying the fragrance of blooming roses, she heard the back door open. Terrence walked out, a smile on his face and an envelope in his hand. "Hey, Mama," he said, sitting down beside her. "This came for you today." Mrs. Evelyn opened the envelope curiously. Inside was a letter from the mayor's office, inviting her to receive a community service award for her work with the Grief Support Network. As she read the letter, Mrs. Evelyn felt a swirl of emotions, pride, gratitude, and a touch of nostalgia. She looked up at Terrence, her eyes shining. "Oh, baby," she said softly. "Can you believe how far we've come?" Terrence wrapped an arm around his mother's shoulders, pulling her close. "I can, Mama. You're the strongest person I know. You've turned your pain into purpose, and you've helped so many people along the way." Mrs. Evelyn leaned into her son's embrace, her thoughts drifting to James. She could almost hear his voice, filled with pride and love. "We did good, Evie," he seemed to say. "We did real good." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, Mrs. Evelyn felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The pain of losing James would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had found a way to honor his memory by living her life to the fullest, by spreading love and hope to others who were suffering. She thought back to those dark days when she had tried to harm herself, when the grief had seemed too heavy to bear. How different things were now. She had faced her pain, worked through it, and emerged stronger on the other side. And in doing so, she had not only saved herself, but had become a beacon of hope for others. "You know, Terrence," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I think I'm ready for whatever comes next. Whether it's more time in this garden, more work with the support groups, or something we haven't even thought of yet. I'm ready, because now I know that as long as we have love, as long as we have each other, we can face anything." Terrence squeezed his mother's hand, his heart full of love and admiration. "That we can, Mama, that we can." As they sat there, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to deep purple, Mrs. Evelyn felt grateful for every moment, the joyous ones and the painful ones alike. For it was all of these moments, strung together, that had brought her to this place of peace and purpose. And as the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Mrs. Evelyn whispered a quiet thank you to her family, to the friends who had supported her, to the countless individuals whose lives had touched hers through the support groups. But most of all, she thanked James, her beloved husband, whose love had given her the strength to keep living, to find meaning in the face of loss, and to transform her grief into a force for good in the world. As night fell fully, Terrence helped his mother back into the house. Mrs. Evelyn paused at the doorway, taking one last look at the starlit sky. "Good night, my love," she whispered, a serene smile on her face. "Until we meet again, I'll keep living, loving, and making you proud." And with that, she wheeled herself inside, ready to embrace whatever new adventures tomorrow might bring. And that's the incredible story of Evelyn and Terrence, a family's journey from heartbreak to healing. What started as a series of mysterious falls led to the discovery of a deep, hidden pain that no one had seen coming. Through love, patience, and support, they were able to come together and help Evelyn find peace once again. If this story of resilience and family strength touched you, be sure to let us know in the comments. We hope it serves as a reminder to check in on those we love, because sometimes the struggles they're facing aren't always visible. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one.